Welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast. I am Tyler Donahue, and welcome into a week in which Penn State football will get onto the practice field for the first time since its recent playoff run. We will be back on the field as well Tuesday. First, we'll get a chance to hear from James Franklin in a press conference setting. A lot to catch up on his squad as they get out into the field again. A lot of new additions to this roster, several important departures. What does it all mean? We'll do our best to weave our way through that narrative of where Penn State football is heading into this spring camp with Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallen in just a moment. We're going to come back to you later this week to preview Pro Day a little bit. It's a really busy week here in Happy Valley. We're starting things off with spring practice debut, and then we're going to close things out on Friday with the NFL decision makers' attention right here on State College. Abdul Carter, Tyler Warren, and the rest of this 2025 Penn State Nittany Lions draft class will get a chance to showcase their skills and really show the nation what they're about now, 1 month removed or shy of the NFL draft. And so we'll break that down a little bit later in the week, but our focus here will be spring ball, and Mark Brennan, Daniel Gallen going to do a great job in helping us get through that conversation in just a moment. But guys, we got to tip our cap toward the direction of Cael Sanderson's team. They are once again the national champions 12 times in the last 14 NCAA tournaments. It has ended with the Nittany Lions as your national champ. Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallen both had a lot of content for us over at Lions247. But in terms of the session-to-session updates, Daniel Gallen was doing a lot of the heavy lifting over the course of this weekend. So we'll begin with you, Daniel. Give our folks a bit of a summary. I know not everybody is glued into wrestling, but this was the weekend to do it as, again, another feather in the cap for Cael and just a remarkable program that they have established here in Happy Valley.
It was definitely a remarkable run through this tournament. Penn State set a new points record, 177 points. That broke their record of 172.5 from last year. They had two individual national champions with Carter Starachi at 184 pounds and Mitchell Messenbrink at 165 pounds. All 10 of the wrestlers who were there in Philadelphia earned All-America status. They were the first program since Minnesota in 2001 to do that, and just the second ever. So, even a program like Cael Sanderson's that seems to have accomplished everything, there's still new things to check off. And, I think that one of the most impressive parts that happened was on Thursday, the first day of the tournament. They went 20-0 to put all 10 of their wrestlers into the quarterfinals. Mark Brennan did a nice job in the scoring breakdown too, looking at the guys who did eventually lose matches, how they did. Penn State had 5 guys, I believe, finish in third place. Like, it was just a very, very impressive performance across the board. I think it's kind of what you expect at this point from Cael Sanderson's program. But at the same time, it's still so impressive to watch and see in action.
No matter what sport you're following, professional, college level, Mark, we've all seen the dynastic runs, teams that you expect to dominate. But I'm not sure anyone's ever covered or followed a program that just does it with authority over and over again and seems to be creating even more of a gap between themselves and the rest of the college wrestling universe. And so, Mark, you were around when Cael was brought to campus. He obviously is one of the most accomplished wrestlers in his own right before you get into his coaching pedigree. Now that we're where we're at, 12 national championship rings between his two hands and his trophy showcase. I think Pat Kraft told us it goes beyond the word dynasty. How would you describe what you've witnessed from this Penn State wrestling community under Cael Sanderson and some of those notes that you were able to compile afterwards? Really interesting nuggets about how Penn State was able to set that points record while producing 2 national champions. It's not like they ran the gamut and had 5 national champions. It was a collective effort to get that point total up.
First of all, remember a few weeks ago, Pat Kraft said if Cael came in and asked for $100 million, he would find a way to give it to him. Cael ought to go in and ask for $100 million because if there's a coach who deserves it, it's him. No, in all seriousness, if you watched what Cael said after they won their 12th championship in the last 14 events, obviously there wasn't one during the COVID year, he was like, yeah, we're like on to the next thing. I mean, this is like minutes after they won. And he's already thinking ahead to next year. And that's why I put that scoring piece together, because I think it goes to show. I forget what, I don't have the piece in front of me, but it was like 3 or 4 years ago. They had 5 national titles and only scored. They had 5 individual titleists and scored 130 some team points. Still won the national title as a team, but they had 2 this year and scored 177, a record, breaking a record set by Penn State last year. How do you do that? It's by not only having guys who are competing for national titles in the championship round, but when those guys lose, they flush it and get right back after it. The hardcore Penn State wrestling fans will look back to last year when Tyler Kasek, as a freshman, lost in the first round and came back and won 7 straight matches. I think he was like only the first or second person ever to do it, to finish in 3rd place. And, think about it. When you're in that championship round, so people, the way it works, when you're in a championship round, if you lose, you can no longer win a national championship. You drop into the consolations, you're still alive, and you could wrestle back for 3rd. But think about it. Everything you've been training for, everything you've been working for an entire year is suddenly not there. So what has Cale done? He's convinced these guys that, well, maybe that isn't everything. Let's make it about the team. And if you do fall into the consolation bracket, get after it like you're competing for a national title. And that's called evolution, man. I mean, it's unbelievable. When you're great and you're getting better, it's mind-blowing. And now we're hearing today that they got a commitment from another unbelievable young wrestler. And you look at the guys they have coming back, it's amazing. You cannot heap enough praise on what Cale Sanderson and his staff have done. You simply can't. I mean, it's unbelievable what they have done in that sport.
And Lions once again rule the wrestling world. The March Madness basketball tournament marches on while Penn State's basketball roster, starts to develop some changes. There's guys in the portal. They're pursuing other players. And so we're into spring, and we're into spring football. And that's where our conversation can land now, because, guys, we're about 24 hours away from getting back through that fence and standing on the practice field and seeing what Penn State football is going to be all about in 2025. And we got a lot to learn between now and when this team kicks off down the road. But Daniel, as we discussed last episode, it's our first chance to see this squad since they were preparing for the Orange Bowl game against Notre Dame. And because the way college football works, when one season ends, the next edition of that team, there may be familiar faces. There may be on the coaching staff familiar coordinators. And Penn State has all of that, but you're going to have to replace 25 guys with newcomers. And that's where we are. And this is our first chance, albeit acknowledging that we saw some of those freshmen involved during the playoff run. It's our first chance to see what it looks like when the players scatter all those pieces on the field and say, go put in drill work.
Yeah, that's going to be our, an eye opener, I think is the best way to put it. We've talked a lot about these guys. We've thought a lot about them. I know that we've done some hypotheticals about how things could look with different players at different points, but this is going to be our opportunity to, see them in action. I think, I forget who I was talking about exactly, maybe Kobe Howard, that the freshman wide receiver who popped up in winter workouts. This will be an opportunity to, we're not going to necessarily see him do one-on-one work against AJ Harris or, Elliott Washington, but we're going to see him suited up in pads next to juniors, seniors, redshirt seniors, guys who have been around for a long time. It's a good look now to see, how do these guys belong? Do they look like they belong? We can really get some early impressions, beyond just, okay, how does this high school film, maybe translate over? How does this film from Troy, translate over for Devontae Ross and, these other transfers coming in? It's going to be out there. We're going to have like real reference points now for these players. And I think that's really exciting. And it's really going to start to inform how we think about this team that we're expecting to play deep into January once again next year.
Mark, this tends to be a very enlightening month for us, getting a chance to see the team, and for our audience and for our readers over at Lions247.com. Not only are we learning more about the latest installment of a Penn State football roster, but every single practice is going to bring prospects to town. That's going to reach a crescendo, of course, for the blue-white game, April 26th, when you're going to expect a lot of recruits to be on campus and getting a chance to see things in person. But before we get too far, and we have a lot to discuss and preview for spring ball, Mark, we've got a special offer. Get somebody in the door right now who maybe isn't enjoying our VIP coverage, and there's a couple options for how you can do it, and it's coinciding with the start of spring practices.
Yeah, it's not necessarily March Madness here in Happy Valley. We had March Madness a couple days ago. Sorry, that was a bad joke. But, hey, you talked about it, Tyler. Pro Day, spring practice starting, recruiting visits really amping up, and then obviously the blue-white game is going to be a massive recruiting weekend. So a couple things you can do. You can get 50% off an annual subscription, 50% off our normal rate, or take a test drive. I mean, it's a great way to do it. It's going to cost you $1, and you get a month. So it takes you basically through the blue-white game, or through the lead up to the blue-white game. I don't know what dates I'm exactly on here. Pardon me for that. But yeah, so it's $1 for 1 month, and we have to prove it to you. I mean, so come on. If you're really a Penn State fan, and if you really want to get into the recruiting end of it, this is the best way to go about doing it. My recommendation, the vast majority of people who come on for $1 for that first month stay with us. I mean, the vast, vast, vast majority, I'd say just take the 50% offer. But if you're not willing to take that plunge, I know a lot of people kind of tiptoeing around the edges out there. It's well worth your while. You have the transfer portal in hoops just opened today, right? And then in its ultimate insanity, the NCAA has scheduled the football transfer portal to open during most teams' spring practice. So it's going to be madness in its own way, but a good kind of madness. So yeah, come on board, 50% off annual, or $1, 1 month.
Yeah, college football reporting is controlled chaos at this point. We do our best to control the chaos within our little part of the world there at Lions247.com. Hop on board, $1 for 1 month, 50% off for a full year. Whatever avenue you choose to take, we welcome you on board, and we hope to see some new folks over there. Hopefully some people have been listening to the podcast, maybe are ready to take that plunge over to the site. Guys, let's take our plunge into our roundtable discussion. We've been posting these one by one over at Lions247.com for the last couple of weeks, trying to get folks ready, amped up for some of the key storylines, players to watch for spring practice here at Penn State. We're going to work our way through that here in podcast format, and we're going to change the order of who gives those answers when each question. And we're going to begin with Daniel going first. I've got the second pick. I'm sorry, Daniel going first. Mark has the second pick, and I will round us out on the first topic, which is pretty simple. What do you view as the key storyline for Penn State as they get back onto the spring practice field?
Yeah, for this one, I went to the defensive side of the ball with probably the highest profile addition to this Penn State roster, Penn State program of the offseason, with Jim Knowles coming over from Ohio State to be the defensive coordinator. And the storyline for me is, how quickly can this defense get up to speed under Jim Knowles? You look at his history at Ohio State, at Oklahoma State, some of his earlier stops. You can really see things click in that near the end of that second year, in that third year where he's the defensive coordinator. And, when you look at this Penn State roster, it is built to win now. It is built to, make a run this season. There's not necessarily, if you look big picture, I think that James Franklin has, made this program sustainable, and, there is a window that is, open. And, I do think Penn State will still be a contender in, 2 or 3 years. But when you look at everyone who came back this year, you have Drew Aller, you got Zane Durant back tonight, Dennis Sutton, Zachy Wheatley, Dom DeLuca. There's a lot of stuff that, is, in on this year. And so, you can't afford to have any hiccups. Any growing pains need to be minimized. So to me, when you look at where Penn State is right now on March 24th and, where they want to be come January 2026, this defense, can't afford stumbles, can't afford hiccups. And a big part of that is going to be Jim Knowles getting in, working with these assistants, working with these veteran players, and getting this defense so that by the time Oregon comes to Beaver Stadium on September 27th, that it is a unit that is ready to rock.
Jim Knowles was part of a national championship run just a couple months ago. He told us in his introductory press conference he thinks Penn State very close to winning a national championship. He wants to play his part. Mark, where do your focus land on this one?
Yeah, so people know we don't pick the same thing. I mean, so sometimes there's a category where there's an obvious one, probably like this one, where Daniel wisely took the thing that everybody should be focused on. But there are other really important storylines, and to me, one of the most overlooked is the battle to be QB2. You know, you lose Bo Pribula, and here's a guy who won a game for you last year, right, at Wisconsin. So who is going to emerge as that QB number 2? Jackson Smolik had one snap, I think, 2 years ago as a true freshman, missed all of last season because he was bumped up. We did not see him in any contact type things in practice. Is he full go? Let's see where he's at. And then Ethan Grunkemeyer, from all accounts, did a nice job when being forced into that emergency backup role behind Drew Aller in the playoffs last year. But fortunately for Penn State, and this isn't a knock on Grunk, but they didn't need him. I mean, to be put into that as a true freshman would have been very, very difficult. He played in only one game, SMU, threw one pass and it was intercepted. So that is a huge question mark. And again, you have that's a position where Pribula basically won you a game last year. I don't think that's hyperbole. I mean, if they don't have that quarterback, that's going to be a tough game out there at Wisconsin. It still was a tough game and they were able to win it. So which of those guys is able to step up? How prepared is Smolik? I keep wanting to call him Isaac Smolko, who is the former tight end, because their names are so similar. So if I do that, just catch me. But you look at him, he's gotten much bigger, just not huge. But when he first arrived at Penn State, he did not look like the biggest guy in the world. And now he looks more like a college quarterback. And Grunk, he's not the biggest guy either, but I don't know that that's important for him because he could be very mobile as well. And I think we could all pretty much agree that Beckham Kritza is a guy who's slated for a red shirt. If they have to depend on him, they're going to be in real trouble because he's just not ready to go physically. I think his upside is huge. And when you talk to people in the program, which we all have, they love where he can be eventually, including Chuck Losey, the strength coach. But between those two quarterbacks, who's going to kind of emerge? I highly doubt that they're going to name a QB2 during the spring or after the spring. I just think it's the nature of the position anymore where you don't want to say anybody's out of the race. So it's something that will carry on through the summer and then into preseason camp. But maybe we'll get a sense for if one is ahead of the other or if it's even or what. But somebody's going to have to step up eventually, and I think that's going to be key for this team.
Yeah, I don't think we're getting anything on the record for who QB2 is until maybe the last week of August. That's just the way that works. You know that better than anyone, Mark. But
it's weird. I think the last time it might have been O'Brien's first year where he named McGloin the starter, like right after spring practice, and it's like that would never happen now. And just let's be honest. I mean, these quarterbacks, and you can't blame them. If they think they're out of it, they're going to make a jump somewhere else. So. I don't know. I mean, they would be foolish to do it anyway before you get to preseason camp. Take as much time as you need and let these guys have as many opportunities. And one other thing I'll add, I know I'm rambling on here. It's going to be interesting to see how much they dial things back for Drew Aller. Typically with most positions, like last year, I'm sure Tyler Warren barely played in the spring. But the tricky part with a quarterback is you have all these new receivers, and we'll get to the receivers soon enough, but you have all these young receivers, transfers, tight ends who have to step up. Do you want Aller not having as many snaps as possible, or is it better for you to have as many snaps as possible for your backup QB? So that's going to be an interesting balancing act to see how the staff handles that.
I'm going to go over to the trenches here. And I think if you review maybe the top 5 reasons why Penn State did not win a national championship last year, did not, advance to the championship game and win it, you're not going to be discussing offensive line issues. And that's a huge difference for where this program is. The fact that they not only got to the Final Four in college football, but I think you could make a case that they may have featured the best offensive line unit in that Final Four, which is remarkable because this was the position group that everyone was lamenting about a few seasons ago about, how is Penn State possibly going to compete for a national championship when they have this situation playing out in the trenches, a few years removed from not seeing a full-on spring game because they didn't have enough offensive depth to manage that. And here we are a couple months ago. You've got director of scouting here at 247 Sports, Andrew Ivins, referring to this group as the deepest offensive line in football. And I'm really curious as we get our looks over the course of this spring and then ultimately get back into Beaver Stadium in late April is where is Phil Trautwein playing guys? Where's he cross-training players? There's such a mix here where you've got, I believe it's 6 players who started at least 5 games in their college career, and there's only 5 jobs there. And so it's going to be fun and also probably anxiety inducing for a lot of those guys in that room as they compete, try to stay on the field. There's one starting job that's obviously open. Sal Wormley was your starting right guard for the last 3 seasons. He has moved on after his 6th year on campus. Cooper Cousins is a center of attention for that spot. TJ Shanahan came to campus after starting several games as a redshirt freshman for Texas A&M last year. And then you've got a bunch of kind of unproven Penn State players who have blue chip pedigree. Javen Williams, former 5-star, played some guard and tackle last fall as things progressed. Alex Birchmeyer, former top 24/7 prospect, same as Chimdi Ono, both playing that guard position. And then there's talent even on the outside that we've heard good things about, whether it's Garrett Sexton and Egan Boyer, a couple second-year tackles, put on a bunch of weight their first year. Really curious to see how they can handle themselves now on the edge. And you've got the looming absence we anticipate of Anthony Donko, who was injured in late November last year, sidelined for that playoff run. That led Nolan Rucci to play a lot at right tackle and really impress a lot at right tackle. So I think when you remind yourselves that Nick Dawkins is back as a team captain, as a second-year starter at center, Venga Ioane was an early All-American pick for ESPN when they had their 2025 All-American squad. And that's without addressing the fact that they're bringing in a freshman group led by their top-rated signee overall, Malachi Goodman. A few of these guys are on campus. Some of them will be here in the summer. And it's just such a night-and-day situation, fellas, where we're walking onto the field Tuesday, and I know I'll be busy filling out my notebook trying to figure out where all these guys are, a lot of names. And I'm reminded of when we got onto that practice field, was it 4 years ago, and there were maybe a cluster of 7 offensive linemen, and you're just trying to wonder, how is Penn State going to take the next step? They've done that under Phil Trautwein, and I think this huge collection of talent. J.B. Nelson, by the way, a name I didn't even mention. He was their starting left guard for Penn State, I think, for 8 or 9 games a couple of years ago. I think what looms over this for me, guys, is you've got that spring transfer window, that final week of practice leading up to the blue-white game. You know, where are guys going to sense where they're at on this depth chart? There's a lot of names I just went through, a lot of guys who have high hopes for their careers. I think I'll be really curious to see how the competition shakes out and if they can retain all this talent beyond the spring practice transfer window, because that's kind of the next test here for this roster. Shifting over to our next spot, and I know Daniel's going to rehash a lot of what I just went over because he's got offensive line on his mind. But, Mark, we begin with you at position to watch, and where else will we go? Wide receiver.
Yeah, I remember it wasn't so long ago, as you said, Tyler, that we were saying, wow, what's going to happen with the offensive line? And basically, it got to the point where James Franklin said, I'm done talking about it. They're just going to go out and prove it on the field. And we kind of got that same message last year about the receivers, didn't we? It didn't quite work out that way. Just rewinding to last year, Daniel batted 3rd in this category and took wide receiver. I'm batting 1st and taking receiver. You can't come out of a national championship semifinal game with your receivers having 0 catches without it being a problem. And then your top 2 pass catching receivers both enter the portal and land elsewhere. So Marcus Higgins, is this just a fresh reboot? I mean, there's a couple veterans coming back, but you talk about Liam Clifford. He's been around for a long time, but he had way fewer catches than Nick Singleton last year. Caden Saunders, he's now 4 years into his career and has been injured and has yet to really make an impact. So how are things going to kind of play out there? You're in a situation where you're bringing in a couple of transfers in Devontae Ross from Troy and Kyron Hudson, a former Trojan. Yeah, Troy Trojan. I'm sorry, that was pretty stupid. But both of those guys, I think, have the ability, one as maybe a game breaker in Ross, and one is a more consistent force. And we'll get into this a little bit more later in Hudson. And you have a bunch of young players who, again, we'll get into some of this a little bit later. But I don't know that you could look at what happened with this position last year, where even though you got good moments from Harrison Wallace, and even though you got good moments from the other receiver, whom I'm trying to blank on, Amari Mari Evans. Even though you got good moments, there was zero consistency. And it's been that way the last 2 or 3 years, right? I mean, even when Lambert Smith was here, he was all over the place. He was great for the first half of one season and was terrible for the end of it. And then the previous year, he was terrible the first half and then great the second. There's been zero consistency. I think this is a big spring, not only for that position, but for the position coach. Because now it's all your guys, right? I mean, basically most of your guys. You know, you're here, it's what, year 3, and they really have to start seeing some development out of that position, seeing players getting better, seeing players improving, and seeing players step up. You know, you also look at losing an unbelievable pass catcher at tight end in Tyler Warren, and I think it would be unfair to expect the tight ends to make up for all of what he gave you in terms of passing game production. So I'm looking at the wide receivers, and we'll drill down to specific players as we go along. But I think it's a huge thing for Penn State this spring and then in the entire offseason.
Yeah, Liam Clifford, as you mentioned, the only guy on this roster who owns at least 10 receptions in a Nittany Lions uniform at the receiver position. So you're really trying to reset this thing. And Daniel and I alluded to this last episode when Marcus Higgins submitted his competitors of the day after each of those winter workouts. None of those guys ever played in a game for Penn State. It was Kyron Hudson. It was Devontae Ross. It was Peter Gonzalez. It was Kobe Howard. And that's who it was. It was a redshirt freshman who was injured last year. It was a true freshman. And then it was 2 transfer pickups. My position to watch is linebacker. And last year, I just don't know what Penn State would have done if they had to go without Rojas, King, or DeLuca for a significant span. You didn't have Dom DeLuca for a game. Then you brought him back, and he had that cast for a while. By the end of the season, he was out of it. Kobe King was a stalwart for you as a team captain, as a middle linebacker. He played 100 more snaps than any other linebacker. But beyond those top 3 guys, and we know Tony Rojas was battling through his own injury issues during the course of the season. I thought he played his best ball during the playoffs, but those were the 3 out there. Only Tyler Elsdon was also at 100-plus snaps in the 2024 season. He has moved on after his 5th year on campus. So this is a room where I think you take Kobe King out of the equation. He'll be at Pro Day on Friday, not in the practice field this week. And so you know what you've got in Dom DeLuca at this point, a 5th-year senior. Great story. We think that Tony Rojas is due for another step forward in his junior year, although we don't know if he's going to be available for spring ball after getting some things cleaned up medically this offseason. What that means is we got a lot to figure out about everybody else. Tamir Robinson, Keon Wiley. You go down that list of younger players, Kari Jackson and Anthony Specca, who came to campus last year. No one burned their red shirt this last year, so it's not like we have a good sample size on that class. And then Takari Nelson, who was also involved quite a bit. He transitioned from safety last season. He started in place of Dom DeLuca, but after that game, we never really saw him get significant run for the rest of the way, except for special teams. So, guys, I think when you look at linebacker, and they like to pride themselves as LBU around here, there's a lot to figure out for Jim Knowles and Dan Connor. It's great that Dan Connor already pretty much ran this room last year as an analyst. He should know everybody and their skill set and kind of where they're at in their trajectory, but we don't quite know that yet. And so for me, position to watch, linebacker, because we know about 2 of the 10 guys that we might see on the field, what they're all about. The other 8, we're not quite sure yet. So a lot to learn there. And Daniel, what do you round us out here with our positions to watch?
Yeah, I feel like usually when we do this exercise, like you guys laid out, it's positions that could potentially be weaknesses or positions where there's, you're losing players and there's questions about who's going to step up and replace them. Penn State has done a nice job fortifying its roster over these past couple of years. So I want the offensive line here. I think that it's worth watching because of what Tyler laid out in his earlier answer. You said maybe like 15 names probably of different guys that are worth paying attention to on that offensive line. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how Phil Trautwein balances all of that. Like we've talked about before, Trautwein has established that if you deserve to play, you're going to play. We've seen that with some of the rotations that they've had. Last year, you saw that a little bit at left guard, a little bit at right guard. We thought we were going to see it earlier in the season at right tackle with Donka and Rucci before Donka really asserted himself there. So I'm really curious, who puts themselves in position to force a rotation, because when you look, you could see rotations at maybe 3 spots, even 4 spots. I don't think you would rotate your center. And so I think that just makes for an interesting dynamic. And then, sometimes these dynamics have consequences, like what happens from a player retention attrition standpoint as we get earlier on. I think it's just going to be, really fascinating to watch. And, we've talked about it before where, practice, Troutwine and Frank Leonard will have two separate full offensive lines going at the same time. Feels like this year they could have three with the bodies that they have in there. I think that's just going to be a really unique and fun position to watch this spring.
It also feels like they have three full-time coaches with Nick Dawkins back as a six-year senior. I mean, he comes across more as a coach than as a student athlete at this point, almost when you converse with him. We'll jump over to our freshmen to monitor during spring ball. Again, a unique situation here where a lot of these guys are not making their practice debut. They got a chance to do that during the playoff run. We had a photo galleries up. We had some conversation from those freshmen getting acquainted on the practice field during the winter, but a real big chance here for them to spend the next month investing in their futures. Coaching staff get a chance to see how they may factor into some of these competitions. And so my freshman to watch is in a position room where it feels like perennially we can kind of count on someone flirting with burning their red shirt. Usually they do burn their red shirt. Cornerback room. Last year it didn't happen, but I'll remind everybody they had two transfers come in, play a bunch of football, start for them. This year you don't have that transfer impact on the room. We got to acknowledge that Elliott Washington is doing remarkable things this offseason, 6 for 6 as competitor of the day. Davian Collins is a guy that really finished on a high note, I think, last year. And then you've got a lot of young pieces working their way through the process. And A.J. Harris, of course, back as a junior starter at cornerback. But I think there's room for a freshman cornerback. And the one I would lay my bet on is Darius Dixon, coming from a program at Modern Day that is an absolute NFL college football talent factory there in Southern California, a multi-year impact within that program, played a variety of roles in that defensive secondary, someone who could contribute here in the slot, someone who could contribute on an island in coverage as well. And at 6 foot, pushing towards 190 pounds when he got to campus, and with a lot of maturation focus in the conversations that we've had with Penn State coaches and staff members, it seems like he's somebody who's physically, mentally ready to get after it in that room. And I think when you kind of combine the dynamic skill set that he brings with what has kind of already been proven at a program like Mater Dei, there's not going to be a lot of surprises, I think, for a player jumping from that program to Penn State versus a player maybe coming from a run-of-the-mill public institution. And so I think he's the guy I would lean toward overall in the defensive roster. And I think defensively, again, this is another year where when you look at the freshmen are going to be involved, I would probably lean more toward that side of the ball than offense. So I got Dixon. And Daniel, who are you giving us?
In this type of exercise, there's a lot of different places to talk about the wide receivers, and this is going to be another one for me.
That's why I didn't mention everybody earlier, because I think we're all getting a bite of this apple.
I went with Matthew Outen, the freshman from Virginia. He's a top 24/7 recruit, and someone who did a lot of different things on the football field, during his high school career. I submitted this pick before we talked to Chuck Losey, and he, had good things to say about Kobe Howard. I submitted it before we had Kobe Howard go, back to back on, competitor of the day at wide receiver. But I think with Outen, part of the reason I'm spotlighting him is that recruiting pedigree. Over on 24/7 Sports, we have him as a 4-star recruit, number 10 athlete in the country, number 196 overall. I think that coming in, he's, has someone with a lot of attention, and he has a little bit of a different body. Penn State listed him at 6'1", 205. That's a little bigger, a little on the taller side. I'm curious how that fits on the field and, what ways that you can use him. I just think that coming, out of Portsmouth, Virginia, that he's just a really intriguing prospect. And, when you look at some of these receivers who are new to the roster, I want to see what this looks like on the field. I think that he seems to add a little bit of size. Room's going to get even bigger this summer when Jeff Exner Jr. gets here from McDonough. It's anything with Andy Kotelnicki in this offense. It's like, how does this guy who seems unique, how does he fit in? What can he do? And how can he find a pathway for himself to get onto the field? So I started with Outen from that perspective.
Kobe Howard has the buzz, but Outen is the one that is the most highly rated of the bunch of recruits who are in this 2025 class at receiver for Penn State. And Mark, you're taking us back to the defensive side of the ball here for your pick, freshman to watch.
Yeah, unlike Daniel, I waited until after we talked to Chuck Losey to make my pick. I was actually probably heading in similar directions to you guys, but after talking to Chuck, Yvonne Kamaju, I mean, this is what Chuck had to say. And Chuck Losey, the Penn State strength and conditioning coach, I don't know what his title is, but he's the strength coach. Really a no-nonsense guy. And when he talks, you better listen. And I did listen, and here's what he had to say. Yvonne is a monster. He wasn't even asked a question. This was in his opening statement. That this wasn't the opening statement, but it was a part of his long opening statement.
7-minute opening statement.
Yeah, Yvonne is a monster. You guys are going to love him. He's got a monster work ethic, especially. You'll see him when he gets out there. He's a very developed kid for a young kid in his lower half. He's got a ton of strength. He's going to be a good one for us. You know, you're talking about a defensive end, and another reason I went with him is because I don't think we're going to see a whole lot of Dennis Sutton this spring. Would not make a whole lot of sense. He was dealing with bumps and bruises last year. He's proven himself. We know what he's all about. And then what are we going to see of Zariah Fisher and Nittany White? I mean, Zariah missed all of last season. White has, and I think you've mentioned this, Tyler. I think he's played in one game since October of 2023, the transfer from Texas A&M because he had a knee injury. Are they going to take it kind of easy with those guys? I think we have a pretty good feel for what they have in Max Granville and Jalen Harvey. But beyond that, I mean, there's a lot of question marks there. So I think this is an opportunity where I don't see this kid necessarily competing for a starting job come preseason camp, but I do see him competing for a spot in the rotation. When Chuck Losey is heaping this kind of praise on you, and we've seen it in the past, it's usually a pretty good indicator that you have an opportunity to do something. So we had an opportunity to see him at camp last year, at least once, maybe a couple times, and definitely passes the eyeball test. Penn State's listing him at 6'3", 235. Reminds me an awful lot of a guy they had a few years back, a 6'3", 230-pound defensive end named Dion Barnes. So I have a feeling that this guy's position coach is going to know how to work with him because they seem like they're very similar style players. I'm not saying he's the second coming of Dion Barnes, who as a redshirt freshman was defensive freshman of the year in the Big Ten. But I think when you look at somebody with this sort of size coming in the door with a monster work ethic and that the strength coach is raving about, definitely one to keep an eye on in the spring.
Dating back to that early signing period in December, I would say there's two guys who hearing from the staff, it really sounds like they just felt like we're undervalued nationally, that they're absolutely in love with. He's one, Kamaju at defensive end, and the other is Tyke Hayes, who we didn't get around to in this part of the conversation, but we've brought him up over the course of this podcast. He is another freshman to follow in that backfield over the course of this spring. Let's get over to other newcomers on the Nittany Lions roster. How about those transfers? It's a 6-man class. So you're going to hear about half of them during this segment. Transfer to track. Daniel, you kick us off.
Surprise, surprise. What position I'm going to talk about? We've got another wide receiver here. I went Devontae Ross, the Troy transfer. I think coming in with Kyron Hudson, Hudson is someone who I'm intrigued by too, but I think, Kyron Hudson played in the Power 5, now Power 4, for the past 4 seasons. He was at USC last year. I think you know what he is as a wide receiver, more or less. Last year, 38 catches, 462 yards, 3 touchdowns, just a solid guy coming in. I think he has a really, really high floor. But I think Ross coming up from Troy has a really, really high ceiling. 76 catches, over 1,000 yards, 11 touchdowns last year. Not likely that he's going to duplicate those numbers, but I think that he has the talent that he's shown to be a big play guy, make big plays against Big Ten teams. And I think that's something that we have the potential to see, this year of what he's able to do. So, I think Ross is the top transfer to track. Chuck Losey said that he's up 16 or 17 pounds since he's been at Penn State. That would put him up in the upper 170s. He was listed at 161 on the Troy roster last year. He's someone who's going to need to hold up against Big Ten competition, and spring ball is a time where he can figure that out a little bit. He's going to be going against Elliott Washington, AJ Harris, Zion Tracy, these defensive backs who have been around in the Big Ten for a little bit and are pretty good themselves. So how does he make this adjustment? make this leap up to the speed, the physicality, everything that comes with making a leap from the Sun Belt to the Big Ten. He can use all of that now so that by the time we get to September, he's good to go. So I think that Ross is someone that, I want to see him stand next to the other wide receivers. I want to see him, next to some of these defensive backs, these safeties. How does he fit onto the field? And then as we get further on, maybe how's he being used? What kind of impression is he making on his teammates? I think it's going to be a really interesting storyline when you talk about this wide receiver room and this offense as a whole.
Folks probably remember the name Tez Johnson. He was a key difference maker in that Big Ten championship win for Oregon against Penn State last December. He's someone who made the jump from Troy as a standout there at receiver to the Big Ten ultimately with Oregon. It carried over at this level of conference play. You never know what that might look like. And you've got us on the wide receiver beat as well, Brennan. The other name, Kyron Hudson, who actually scored a touchdown against the Nittany Lions last year out in Los Angeles.
Yeah, I was foreshadowing before, a little podcast foreshadowing when I was talking about the lack of consistency. Kyron Hudson did something last year that no Penn State receiver has done since Mitchell Tinsley, the year before Marcus Hagans arrived. He caught at least one pass in every single game that he played. And that, to me, I know where Daniel's going, that having somebody with a high ceiling and explosive is great. But I think this receiver room is in such need of a consistent, just somebody to go out there and get it done game after game that they're going to be there if you need them. No, he's not going to score 90-yard touchdowns, but he's going to go out and grind and get things done. You mentioned that one touchdown catch against Penn State, as Daniel mentioned earlier, stepping all over my guy, giving his stats, 3 touchdown catches last year. But think about this. His one touchdown catch against Penn State was as many touchdown catches as any Penn State receiver returning had all of last year. Liam Clifford had one, and who else had? Somebody else had one as well. So,
Kaiser Denmark, right? Final play of the regular season.
Right. So, it just goes to show you how much they need some sort of form of consistency. And he's also done it at the Power 4 level. So, and that's not a knock on where Ross is coming from. But when you're doing that, not only at the Power 4 level, but in the Big Ten, he knows what he's going to be up against. I mean, he played against the Penn State defensive backs. He knows what this is all about. So I think if he's able to come in and establish some level of consistency, I think it'll be huge for this receivers room.
Hudson was the first transfer on board with Penn State for 2025. That occurred, I guess, 6 or 7 weeks after he played against the Nittany Lions in that loss to Penn State. I'll wrap us up here with transfers to watch and go with a familiar name, although he's, I guess, new to this particular team. King Mack, I think he was a statement pickup for Penn State on the recruiting trail a couple cycles ago. Let's not forget he was a top 100 recruit from an absolute powerhouse in South Florida, St. Thomas Aquinas. If memory serves me correct, he was a part of 4 state championship runs there at St. Thomas Aquinas. He was also one of the premier sprinters in the state of Florida, where they have pretty fast high school athletes. So this guy, he checked off so many boxes. And what we heard about him during his first preseason camp was he loves football. He's making plays. He's a bit of a ball magnet. Over the course of his freshman year here with Penn State, didn't really develop into a consistent player on defense, but he was always out there in special teams coverage. He got some opportunities as a reserve piece at safety. And I think we came out of spring ball last year viewing him as a stock-up player. And all of a sudden he's in the transfer portal and he spends 2024 as a backup and a special teams contributor in Tuscaloosa. It wasn't all that different in terms of on-field impact to what he experienced as a freshman at Penn State. I think now he enters the safety room where you've got to have at least 2 guys step up in that room after you lose KJ Winston and you lose Jalen Reed, and you also lose Tyrese Mills, who had a backup role for you over the course of last year. He's now at UConn as a transfer. So to me, the marriage between the familiarity with Mac, what we already know about his pedigree and his skill set, and then the fact that at safety they have a clear need for someone to step up right now, I think he's a real nice piece for them, where I think he can be that dude where you have some freshmen and redshirt freshmen still finding their footing over the course of this spring into the summer, probably stages of the fall. I think that safety depth chart, as long as there's not some serious injuries again, it can look better come the end of the season than the start of the season because of the youth involved in that room. but that to me means King Mack has to be a contributor, maybe a starter right off the bat, because you look beyond Zachy Wheatley, you like what Dejon Lane was able to do last year, but it wasn't a lot of extensive run. And then you land on King Mack as you work your way through this process. So King Mack to me almost needs to be an instant impact contributor in the transfer class, not just a special teams guy, not just a backup plan, but really in that top 3 conversation for Anthony Poindexter at safety. Don't worry, we're going back to receiver right now, folks. I know we got to keep circling back to that position room. And as we get to our players where it's time to step up. So they've been around the program a while. That clock on their eligibility maybe starting to tick a little bit louder. And Brennan, you're taking us right back to receiver to start this one off.
Yeah, Caden Saunders, we had an opportunity to speak to him at the Thon event at Lash Building a while ago, and it was really refreshing. I mean, this guy has carried himself so well, and he just hasn't been able to get a foothold. I mean, it's an injury. When he came in, he admittedly wasn't in the greatest shape. And last year, it seemed like everything was ready for him to kind of take off, and he had some sort of nagging leg injury that just prevented it from happening. He didn't log a snap. You're the snap guy, Tyler. He didn't log a snap at wide receiver. I think he played in 3 games as a punt return guy, and we saw him in practice, but he just never felt good enough that he was able to go in games. And again, we talk about what this receiver room needs. It needs leadership. It needs consistency. This guy is, to me, he has to prove himself on the field, but I think he's already proven himself as a leader. Going back to his recruiting class, he was one of the ringleaders of that group. He was one of the glue guys who was contacting everybody and recruiting other players. And he has those natural skills. A couple of years ago when they dropped the tough game at Ohio State, he scored a touchdown in that game. A bunch of so-called leaders didn't come out and meet the media. He came out and met the media. I mean, it was, he's there facing these tough questions. And so the leadership skills are there. The speed is there. We know that. We know what he ran in high school. You can see, from what we understand, that he's one of the best at the NFL shuttle on the Penn State football team. Speed, quickness, hands, all those things are there. He just has to stay healthy. Tyler, you were there when we talked to him after the Thon thing. And the quote that you had, and I just want to expound on this a little bit. He said, he was asked what he wants to do this spring. And he said, remind the coaches what I can do and remind the team I'm a playmaker. He initially said, but he stopped. He initially was going to say, show the coaches. And then he caught himself, and it's like, remind the coaches.
Yeah.
Because I think these coaches know what he's capable of doing. We heard nothing but good things about him last offseason, and it just didn't come together because of the injury. So, again, I know I keep beating this dead horse, but that's the one position on offense that, tight end, you lose Tyler Warren. I think you're still going to be in good shape with the amount of talent you have coming back. You guys have fit on the offensive line. We know how good that offensive line is. It goes without saying how good the running backs are. And I think Drew Aller's a proven commodity at quarterback. So the one area is wide receiver, and I think this is a veteran guy. It's hard to believe he's in his 4th year. Seems like yesterday, he was that ringleader I talked about. I mean that in a good way of that recruiting class. So now's the time for him to step up, because if he doesn't, they brought in they brought in 2 transfers. We're talking about the true freshmen who are flashing in winter workouts. Time's ticking a little bit, and this is his opportunity to step up and get it done. I think it's vital because he has the natural leadership skills that I think would be important in that room, but it's much easier to be a leader when you're also producing on the field.
It may be easy to forget now, but there was a point where he was a marquee name in that 2022 recruiting class, which has proven to be at the foundation of Penn State getting to the college football playoff and reaching this year, viewed as a potential #1 overall team. Along the way, he has been just another guy in that class versus a guy who has really helped push Penn State to this point. But he's got more eligibility left. Really key window for him here in the spring. And same goes for the guy I'm going to get to, Zariah Fisher. We've brought him up a few different times over the course of our podcast offseason coverage, but Fisher, year 6, came to campus in 2020 as a linebacker, converted to defensive end in year 2. He's missed significant time in a couple different years. That 2022 season when Penn State reached the Rose Bowl, he spent much of that season in recovery mode. 2023, he was a key rotational piece. And then last year, did not enter a single game because of an injury that occurred early last year. And so Zuriah Fisher, now we're expecting him to be able to get out there and do whatever he needs to do on the practice field, which has not been the case for him for a portion of his career, coming off a strong slate of winter workouts and at a position group where you go beyond Denai Dennis Sutton, guys, gets pretty scary. I think we all think that Max Granville can be a player. Jalen Harvey can be a player. Malachi Williams is another second-year defensive end. He's up a bunch of pounds. You brought in Anai White. There's a lot to like about the pieces, but in terms of what you know, no one handled even 60 total snaps at defensive end on this roster beyond Denai Dennis Sutton. When you lose Amin Vanover, when you lose Smith Vilbert, obviously you already lost Abdul Carter. It takes away a lot of that cushion that you seemingly had last year, where you're able to weather the blow of losing Jamel Lyons in a late stage of the summer because you had these depth pieces. Those pieces are not there anymore. Now you're trying to cultivate them. And so in my mind, a guy who's already been through Big Ten battles, someone who has walked across the coals in his own personal career, trying to get a chance to get back on the field into a 3-point stance, attacking a quarterback. And I expect Zuriah Fisher, as long as he can stay healthy, to maximize his final year on campus. And he needs to be a guy, again, that steps up here for Penn State, considering what they've lost and what we just don't know about the personnel situation in his position group. Daniel, close us out. Veteran whose time to step up is this spring right now.
You're muted.
You're muted, Daniel.
I joined Mark in picking a member of the class of 2022.
I thought you were going to say I joined Mark and not knowing how to use my mute button, because I'm typically the most guilty of that. So Daniel, you get a pass.
I was entranced by those soliloquies about Caden Saunders and Zuriah Fisher. I went with Keon Wiley here. We did a rundown of linebacker earlier in terms of what you have proven coming back versus what is unproven. And Wiley, despite going into year 4, is in that unproven category. We got a good glimpse of him late in games 2 years ago. He really showed he had a nose for the football, was around the ball a lot, made some plays behind the line of scrimmage. He seemed last year going into spring as a player whose arrow was pointing up and was going to have an opportunity to get more playing time, and a spring injury knocked that out for him. He came back in practice late last year, ultimately never made it into a game. But as someone who I think will come into spring with a little bit of a running start because of those practices and be up to speed. There's opportunity for him with Kobe King moving on. He's a unique skill set. I think Tyler and I talked about him last week or on a recent episode about how he came in at 205 pounds, is up into the 220s now, has really physically developed. We know he has pass rush skills from his background at Imhotep and what he was able to do. Wiley is just an interesting player to me that I think there's going to be an opportunity for him. We haven't seen much of him. So what is he going to do with it? What can he show Jim Knowles, Dan Connor, James Franklin? How is this going to shake out? I think that when we get to the fall and we get to September, October, I think he could end up being someone where when you talk about the attention that Penn State linebackers have on them because of LBU and the prestige that is there. I think, Wiley is someone that maybe around the Big Ten, people are like, who is this guy that is making these plays, is around the ball a lot. I think he has that kind of skill set in him. It's just a question of, being able to put it all together, staying healthy, working his way onto the field so that he can make those things happen.
We have a lot more over at Lions247.com. Looking ahead towards spring ball, I had a piece up Friday breaking down 7 key storylines for the depth chart as we start to learn more about the Nittany Lions. For the sake of this podcast conversation, we're going to bring you one more topic and go through our 3 selections. We'll begin with Daniel, and then it'll go to Mark and myself. And this one that we'll finish on is player who's going to prove to be the most difficult for Penn State to replace. And they've got a couple headliners in the conversation. That's clear. Maybe guys who are going to land the top 10 for the first time since 2000, where Penn State get multiple players in the top 10 of a draft with Tyler Warren and Abdul Carter. So those guys were clearly there for the taking. I had the third pick. I'll let you know who I got. But Daniel, what did you go with? Warren or Carter, and why?
Yeah, I think I did a little bit of a stretch here, picking Warren first. I know that the potential number 1 overall pick in the draft should be a slam dunk, and maybe I should have gone there. But I think that when you look at what Warren did last year and how much of the offense that he was, it's such a void there. More than 100 catches, more than 1,000 yards. Talk about what he did with the ball in his hands as a runner, as a passer, in addition to receiving. It's just so much for Penn State to replace. And the good thing about it, the way that they've recruited, the way that they've stockpiled talent, especially at tight end, they don't need one player to do that. They don't need Khalil Dinkins to show up and catch 100 passes this fall. They can split it between a couple different guys. But I just think that with wide receiver being such a question mark and really no one proven there, and then you look at the tight ends, I think it's a lot of guys we're excited about. Khalil Dinkins has shown that he is a Big Ten caliber tight end. Luke Reynolds has, flashed some stuff and I think could be a real breakout player this fall. Andrew Rappelier, we'll see how he is coming back from that injury. But he is someone who there's a lot of excitement about. And then you've got a billion freshmen who've come in who could find their way to the field one way or another. But I just think that Warren just had so much, and that there isn't someone that you feel like you can point to on this team and say at least like there's 50 catches, there's 25 catches, there's another 25. Let's break up that 104 in these different ways. Now, the way that this team is constructed, you've got maybe the best running back duo in the country. So it's not the most imperative thing to get a passing game that's going for 4,000 yards and 35 touchdowns. But I think you're going to need people to catch the ball. You're going to need that to be a threat. Drew Aller is going to need guys to step up. And last year that was Warren. He was the offense in certain games. And you take that away, couple that with Harrison Wallace and Amari Evans moving on. There's just a lot out there for the taking. And I think that is going to be really tough to replace and is a big question mark this spring.
To think about where Drew Aller is year 3 as a starting quarterback, year 4 on campus. And when he's been the trigger man, the receiver situation just has not been great. It hasn't been where you want it to be. And he's really been able to lean on that tight end play. Theo Johnson and Tyler Warren as a first-year starter, Tyler Warren as a second year in his second year. And now you just look around the field and you say, well, where are all those snaps? Where's all that trust going to be going in the direction of for Drew Aller? A lot to learn here. Mark, you had the easiest second pick we probably ever had in roundtable history here. They're going to miss Abdul Carter. Tell us why and what you think about the situation.
I would say that I gave serious thought, and I'm not joking here, about Kobe King, just because, he's the play caller of the defense, and who is the natural fit to step in there. It's nobody who's really proven. So I do think an argument could be made there, but I mean, come on, when you look at what Abdul Carter did, he was the best game wrecker in the nation last year, leading the nation in tackles for loss, 22.3, 12 sacks. I won't go through everything that he did on the field because everybody saw it, but I think you have that element. And that what we mentioned earlier, what you have returning. I mean, Dennis Sutton is a proven commodity. But, you mentioned Zariah Fisher and I mentioned Anai White earlier, both of these guys coming off of serious injuries. Granville and Jalen Harvey, both we're hearing have huge upsides. We saw some really good things out of both of those guys, but they combined for 3 tackles, 1 tackle for loss, and no sacks last year while both were redshirting. Jordan Mayer, the Wisconsin transfer, was mostly a special teams guy last year. So I think when you combine what Abdul Carter did and what they have coming back, I think they're going to be fine at defensive end. I think there's enough talent there between the players I mentioned and even others that have recruited real well. And I think we have a pretty good feel for what Deion Barnes is able to do as a defensive end coach. But there's a difference between being just fine and there's a difference between being between that and being a dominating defensive line. And I think when you remove a player like Abdul Carter, I don't think there's any sugarcoating how difficult that could be. Overall, plenty of talent there, and I think Denai is going to have an opportunity. I would be surprised if he's not right there for first team All Big Ten honors. but you need two of them. I mean, you can't just have one. And we saw that last year with, when I think Abdul made Deni a better player and Deni made Abdul a better player. Who's going to emerge over on that other side? That's going to be pretty interesting to watch.
Warren and Carter were primetime guys too. I mean, you were able to lean on them when it mattered most. And you can't always say that for the biggest stars in college football, but these guys, crunch time, got it done. And so a lot to replace there. I did go with Kobe King with the third pick. I think with Warren and Carter off the board, I had a little bit more room to think about this. I thought about Jalen Reed because, the mind that he brought to the field and also the versatile component he was for the defense. But in my opinion, Kobe King coming off a career best year, almost 100 tackles, authoritative presence for this defense. He was the guy getting the signals called to him from Dan Connor via Tom Allen every game of the season. And I thought outside of some issues early for the operation of that, it went really well for him being the guy with the dot on his helmet. And so, again, I mentioned this earlier, but he played about 100 snaps more than any other linebacker on this roster in 2024. Only two guys were even over 100 snaps who are actually on this team still. So he was so far and away the most consistent presence at linebacker from a production standpoint, from a leadership standpoint. KJ Winston goes down in week 2. All of a sudden, he's your last defensive captain standing for the rest of the season. So I think to remove him from the equation leaves a pretty big void, and that's why I go with Kobe King being the most difficult to replace beyond Carter and Warren. As mentioned earlier, 50% off a full annual subscription to Lions247.com. Or if you want to take a look at our coverage of spring practice from a recruiting standpoint, from an on-field perspective, $1 for 1 month gets you on board. I believe this sale goes through March 31st. So you've got this final week of March to take advantage. Come on board with us. We'll be back in with James Franklin for a press conference at noon on Tuesday. A few hours later, we'll be back on the practice field, and we'll have our full notebook, photo galleries, everything else you've come to expect from our practice coverage at Lions247.com. For now, Daniel and Mark, we're done with the stage setting. We're going to get to go out there, see this team out there, and we'll do our best to report on what happens. And we'll regroup for another podcast later this week, tell you a little bit about our initial takeaways from the practice field, and turn our attention toward what should be a very eventful pro day event come Friday here in Happy Valley. Mark, Daniel, always appreciate your time. Always respect your opinion. Thanks for hopping on with us.
Thanks, Tyler.
Yep.
All right. For now, I'm Tyler Donahue stepping aside. This has been the Lions 247 Podcast.